second video for the Moonee Valley Libraries. My name is Grant Szuveges, FIDE Master, and today we're going to have a look at another game, but this game was played by a player much more famous than me. This player was called Paul Morphy. Now, a lot of people ask me when I mention this, was Paul Morphy the world champion? No, he wasn't, because Paul Morphy lived before the World Championship was ever created in chess. So Morphy lived before world champions were around, but Morphy was considered the best player in the world at the time. And the game we're going to look at is one of the most famous games of chess ever played. Now, this game was played in 1854, so over 150 years ago. Now, the standard of chess was nowhere near as good back then as it is now. So it's debatable how good Morphy was, but definitely he wasn't as strong as the world champion these days. And a lot of people argue he's not even as strong as an average master these days. So it's very hard to really compare players of different eras. But in any case, he was definitely the strongest player in the world at the time. Now, the other interesting thing about this game is where it was played. It was played in 1854 in Paris, but where? What building? A lot of the time when I ask this question to a class, people will say it was played at a chess club, or it was played at a school, or it was played at a cafe, or something like that, but no, it wasn't. This game was played in the Paris Opera House during an opera. This is why it's called the Opera House game. So this was played during an opera, while an opera was going on. Now, this would be like playing a game of chess during a rock concert in these days. Okay, so who was Morphy playing against? Morphy was actually playing against two people at once. So the two guys who were playing as black against Morphy, these were figures from royal courts. They were the Duke Karl and the Count Eosard. So these were not kings or queens, but they were royalties, celebrities. I suppose they were the era's equivalent to the Kardashians or somebody like that. So Morphy's playing during an opera against two B-grade royalty type people. All right, let's have a look at this game. And he happens to play one of the most famous games ever. He starts the game off with e4. Typical for Paul Morphy, he almost always played e4. In the centre, the Count and the Duke, working together, played e5. And Morphy continued with his knight out to f3. So just like in the game I showed you in the last video, knight out to f3. This wasn't the only move Morphy would play though. Morphy did sometimes play f4, an incredibly aggressive opening called the King's Gambit. Very sacrificial opening, but that's not the topic of this video. So he continued with knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5, and these days most people will play knight to c6. But in this game, the Count and the Duke played d6. Defending the pawn, and there's a name for this move. This is called Philidor's defense, and that's named after a guy called Francois Philidor. And Philidor lived in the 1700s, and he was the first truly modern chess thinker. A lot of what we know today as chess players, a lot of things that are accepted about chess, because Philidor came up with them. Philidor discovered them. So he was the first truly modern chess player. So he came up with this move, d6, defending the e-pawn, and it's known after him, Philidor's defense. Morphy plays the right move here, d4, and this move's still played to this day. This is the move that basically most strong players would play, world champions would play this. The idea is it attacks the e5 pawn. So you're threatening pawn takes pawn, and then knight takes pawn. This is what we call calculation. This is what all good chess players do. I take their pawn, they take my pawn, I take their pawn with the knight. You might even throw in, I take their pawn, they take my pawn, I take their queen, they take my queen, and then I take the pawn with my knight in the centre. And the Count and the Duke needed to defend against this. Now, if this game was played these days, Black would probably play pawn takes pawn. That's considered the normal move here, or the best move. But bear in mind, this game was played over 150 years ago. So the power of this move hadn't been appreciated or discovered, whichever way you look at it. Black played a move that was quite common back then. Black played bishop down to g4. And so you might remember from the last video about the tactical toolbox, we've got this tactic. This is called a pin. The idea the bishop's pinning the knight down against the queen. If the knight moves, Black will take the queen. All right, so Morphy played the right move here. Pawn takes pawn on e5. Good move. The idea is that if Black takes back with the pawn, Morphy won't take the pawn with the knight because he'll lose the queen to the pin. What he'll do, he'll trade queens. Queen takes queen here. And Black takes the queen with the king, and then he'll jump in and take the e5 pawn. So I'll show you that on the board, in fact. Take the pawn here, and see, that's a fork too. A fork on the bishop and on the pawn. Remember a fork when we attack two pieces at once. So Morphy played pawn takes pawn. Here, I'll just put the pieces back so we see where they are. So he played pawn takes pawn with the idea that if they take, he'll trade queens and then take on e5. But the Count and the Duke played, instead of taking back first, they threw in an in-between move. They played bishop takes knight. Bishop takes f3, attacking Morphy's queen, and Morphy takes the bishop back with the queen, developing the queen at the same time. So remember, good players play moves that do two things at once. He recaptures the bishop and develops the queen. The Count and the Duke recapture the pawn in the centre, and now Morphy develops another piece with an amazingly strong threat. He develops his f1 bishop and he brings it out to c4. Now, what is that bishop threatening? I'll give you a clue. The queen's helping it. So you've had, I can't really give you more time because it's a timed video. So the queen and the bishop are both hitting the f7 pawn. So if that queen takes that pawn, like this, that will be checkmate. Because the king's in check, queen and bishop battery. The king can't take the queen because of the bishop, and it can't move to these two squares because of the queen. So an incredibly dangerous threat, and Morphy's opponents need to get out of it. They got out of it by blocking the queen's attack on the pawn. They played knight out to f6. Okay, so they blocked out the queen. This is not the best move here. Queen to f6 is actually the best move. And just last year, somebody played that exact move against me in the exact same position. So we actually followed the Opera House game for part of that game, which I won with some sacrifices too. Anyway, knight to f6, blocking out the queen. Morphy plays a great move now. He continues this attack on the f7 pawn, but he does it a different way. He moves the queen across to b3. And see, now the bishop and the queen are still attacking f7 together with the battery. The only difference is the battery here, the queen's behind the bishop. So if they were the other way around, the queen could take on f7 with mate. But what he's threatening to do, he's threatening to take on f7 anyway. Then the king has to move out, and then he'll come in to e6, and that's checkmate because of the battery here. So Black's in a real pickle now. Black needs to get out of this. So threatening f7. The other thing too with this queen move, this is a fork in a way. It's attacking f7. It's also attacking b7. So there's a fork. This pawn is undefended and this pawn is undefended. So when your opponent's attacking two of your pieces, you've got to identify which one's the one that you really need to save. Now, you never really want to lose any material in a game of chess, but some pieces are worth more than others. And if you lose this one, you'll get checkmated. So the Count and the Duke identified this, and so they played queen out to e7, defending the pawn. And now, I think everyone looking at this these days, and I'm sure anyone playing this these days, would use the queen to go and win this b7 pawn, but not Morphy. I'll just show you the reason Morphy didn't do it. Morphy didn't take the pawn because he didn't really want the Count and the Duke to play queen b4 check, forking the king and the queen, because then Morphy would have to trade queens. Bishop would take back. And he didn't want to get the queens off the board. If this was played these days, a player would be more than happy to trade queens when they're winning. Not Morphy though. Morphy always wanted to attack. That was the era. People played a bit differently then. So what Morphy did, he just developed pieces. He brought his knight out to c3 into the centre. One thing about studying Morphy's games, it really helps you as a chess player. It helps you become stronger because you really notice how much emphasis he puts on developing pieces and how powerful those pieces are in the middle of the board. They're far more powerful in the middle. All right, so knight out. See, if you leave your pieces on the back rank and they're not doing anything, it's like playing a game of footy with players sitting on the bench. You want them out in the middle. Okay, so knight out to c3. That knight can do a lot of damage in the middle. Okay, so black played a good move now. Black recognised it. The two players playing black recognised they needed to defend that b7 pawn. So they played a discovered defence. They played c6. Discovering a defence. So we talk about a discovered attack. This is a discovered defence. Pawn up to c6. So you see the queen's not protecting the pawn at this stage, but once that pawn moves up, there's the defence. Queen defends the b7 pawn. And the other thing with this move is it stops the knight getting into this square. Like it cuts down the knight's options. The knight can't go to d5 because the pawn guards it. The knight also can't go to b5 because the pawn guards it. c6 is a good move here. Okay, so Morphy just continued. Morphy continued developing pieces with impact. He developed his bishop to g5. Okay, so not only is he developing the bishop, he's pinning the knight against the queen. There's another tactic, a pin. Pin the knight down, it can't move, and if it does, we'll take the queen. Now, this is starting to get difficult for the Count and the Duke. Where do they move? Ideally, they'd like to bring that knight into the game. Where does it go though? It can't go here, it's natural square because there's a pawn there. If it goes out to here, well, you take away the defence of that pawn. The queen takes the pawn at b7, so they can't really do that. They can't develop the bishop either because it's blocked by the queen. So what they decided to do, instead of developing their own pieces, they thought, well, let's kick Morphy's pieces out of the centre. Okay, let's try to push them away from the centre. So the move they played was b5. And the idea was that you try to push Morphy's bishop out of the middle. The only problem was that Morphy was never going to take a backward step. Morphy decided, all right, well, you're going to push pawns up, I'm going to keep going forward. And Morphy played what was considered back then, and still now, a very beautiful move. He sacrificed the knight for 2 pawns in order to open up Black's king. He played knight takes b5, giving up his knight for 2 pawns. Now, if this was played these days, I think most players would probably not take that knight because they'd recognise how much trouble they'd get into when they do take the knight. But this was an era when it was considered very bad manners not to accept a sacrifice. So if your opponent sacrificed a piece and you didn't take the piece, that would be considered very rude. It would be like burping at the dinner table or something like that. It would be considered, or putting your feet on the table. It was very, very rude. So the Count and the Duke, as they wanted to behave like gentlemen, and they took the knight, as they were expected to do. Morphy took back with the bishop, and that's a check. And all right, how does black get out of this check? One way is to move the king to d8. The problem with that, though, is bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, and then the white queen jumps into d5, and that's a fork on the king and the rook. So you're going to win the rook there. So because of this, the Count and the Duke decided not to move the king. They decided to block the check. The way they blocked the check is they moved their knight into d7. Okay, now you might recognise we've got two pins here. This bishop is pinning the knight against the king, so this knight won't be able to move. It's pinned against the king. And this knight is pinned as well, but it's pinned against the queen. So these knights are in a real pickle. They're really not great. So, and Morphy was exactly the type of player who would take advantage of this. So Morphy understood that when you pin your opponent's knight, you attack the knight with the other pieces. And I said this in the last video, when you pin a piece, bring your other pieces in again. I use the analogy of a pride of lionesses at hunting. When they go after something, they all come in from different angles. Okay, so Morphy brought in another lioness or another piece and attacked that knight. What other piece can attack the knight? Now I was showing this game to someone the other week, and they suggested, what about rook d1? Now, okay, that's what you want to do, but they only played half the move. That's only half the move. The move that Morphy played was castles queenside. So when we castle 1, 2, rook on the other side, castling queenside. That brings the rook to the middle and it gets the king safe. So another one of those moves that good players do. Good players play moves that do more than one thing at once. So in one move, Morphy was able to get his king safe. He was able to get the rook onto the pin piece, attacking it, and he was able to link his rooks. 3 things in one move. Really strong move, castles. And you see now he's threatening bishop takes knight. So if he takes that knight, black can't really recapture that bishop. You see, take the knight, black can't take back with the king because that will be check with the rook. And if you take the knight, black can't take back with the queen because the rook will take the queen. If you take the knight, black can't take back with the knight because then this bishop over here will take the queen because that knight's also pinned. So very difficult position for black. And the Count and the Duke were pretty good players for their era. They were certainly not weak players for that era, and they recognised this. They understood what Morphy was doing, and they found probably the best move. They recognised they had to defend that knight again with another piece. So they brought their own rook into d8, guarding the knight. So now if the bishop takes, they just take back with the rook and they're safe. They're okay here. But what Morphy recognised now was, I suppose, what made Morphy so brilliant. Most of us will look at this position and someone would ask, what's this? And we'd say, well, it's a knight, or we'd say it's a horse. Morphy would look at it and say, that's a pinned piece. And he'd recognise that it doesn't matter whether that's a knight or any other piece. It's pinned. And if it's pinned, it can't move. So it doesn't matter if it's a knight, a rook, a queen, or whatever it is. If it's pinned, it can't move. So Morphy, like a magician, turned that knight into a rook. Played an amazing move here. Rook takes knight. Great move. Now let's have a look what happens. Can't take back with the king because that'll be check with the bishop. And you can't take with a queen or you'll just lose your queen. Bishop will take it. If you take back with a knight, well, that's pinned. This bishop will take your queen. So the count and the duke had to take back with a rook. And Morphy recognised this. Morphy had seen this. He'd worked it out. Now, once again, he followed that same principle. Attack the pinned piece. That's the pinned piece. And just like our analogy about the lionesses coming in from all different angles, in comes the other rook. Rook comes in to D1, attacking the rook. And black's in the same problem again. How does black defend the pinned piece? White wants to take the rook. Well, you won't be able to take back with the king because the rook guards that. You won't be able to take back with the queen because the rook guards it. And the knight can't recapture because it's pinned. The bishop will take the queen. So the count and the duke came up with a move that almost got them out of this. They did very well to get out of this as well as they did. They played queen to e6. So to understand this move, okay, I'll go through a little bit of this so you can understand how this works. This knight's pinned at the moment. And so if the knight will ever take back, white will win the queen. So what the count and the duke did, they moved the queen up. So now, when Morphy takes the rook, they can take back with the knight, and they're not in any danger of losing their queen. You see, here, take the rook, knight takes back, there goes the queen. Bishop takes it. So, queen moves to e6. Okay, so it looks like they've got themselves out of it now. So, Morphy took the rook, played bishop takes rook. So, sorry, just take these off. Bishop takes the rook. And as we said before, king can't take back because of the rook here. Queen can't take back because of the rook. But the count and the duke were fine with this. They took back with the knight. And it looks like they've actually got themselves out of the mess. See, it looks pretty good, doesn't it? They've managed to avoid losing more material. In fact, they're a piece up. But Morphy had seen one move further, or probably more than that actually. But he'd seen the next move. And again, he recognised that it doesn't matter what the pieces are, if they're doing more, they're going to be more powerful. He wants his rook on d8. Why does he want the rook on d8? Because if the rook gets to d8, that'll be checkmate, because the bishop is protecting it and the king won't be able to go anywhere. But that knight is stopping this rook from getting to d8. So Morphy has to force that knight out. Now, there's two sorts of moves in chess that we consider forcing moves. Checks and captures. So there's no capture that he can do here that's going to help, but there's a diabolical check. He runs his queen down to b8. Check. Wow, look at this. How does black get out of this one? The king can't move up to here because that'll be checked with the bishop. And the king can't move over here because that's still check. Nothing can block the check, but there's one move black can play, and well, black has to play it. Black has to take the queen. So Morphy voluntarily gave up his queen. He sacrificed his queen. Queen b8 check. The knight had to take the queen, and it did take the queen. Oops, we'll just fix that up. Knight takes the queen. And now Morphy's rook runs down to the end of the board to d8 and delivers a very powerful checkmate while the opera's going on. So rook's giving check to the king. King can't take the rook because of the bishop. King can't go to d7 because of the rook. Can't go to e7 because of the bishop. So a magnificent checkmate played during an opera in the Paris Opera House in 1854. So this is a very famous game. You can find that game all over the internet if you want to look at that game in more depth. If you've got questions, why didn't he move here? Why didn't he move there? And that sort of thing. You can find that game. It's very easy to find. The Opera House game. It's also called A Night at the Opera. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you look at more of Paul Morphy's games because they're absolutely wonderful games for learning from. Thank you, and I'll see you next video.